Okay, so continuing on with our videos about AUC Section 210, terms of engagement, come down here to the section about initial audits, including re-audit engagements, and that we're going to be exploring AUC Section 210.11 and 12. So this part is about initial audits. These would be audits where you are deciding whether to accept a new client that needs an audit. And this includes where you're auditing the financial statements that have been audited before by another auditor. So there are a lot of other things that we need to do when we're bringing on a new client to provide an audit. But since this AUC section is for terms of engagement, this discussion is going to be limited to the acceptance or deciding whether or not to accept a new audit. And so what's very important about this is that before we accept an initial audit engagement, management needs to give us access to the predecessor auditor, so the auditor that audited their financial statements in the prior year, so that we can talk to him about certain matters regarding the audit that he did in the prior year. And it should be done before we accept the engagement at all. And so if management refuses to let us discuss things with the predecessor auditor, we should consider that refusal in deciding whether we should accept the engagement. And once we've held the discussion with the predecessor auditor, we should evaluate his responses and consider the implications in determining whether we should accept the engagement or not. And so there's some more explanatory material regarding this topic, so let's go down to sections A27 through 32. Okay, so now we're down in the explanatory material section regarding initial audits and deciding whether to accept this new engagement of a new client. So what's really difficult about complying with this section is that typically if you are trying to get a new client, you provide a proposal to that client to tell them what the fee will be, what the procedures will be and such, or rather what the subject matter will be. But we also have to discuss things with the predecessor auditor before we can accept the engagement. So basically our proposal has to say that here are the terms of our proposed engagement, but this proposal is not final until we've had a chance to talk with your predecessor auditor. So basically the potential client has to narrow down the proposals to one and then give access to the predecessor auditor to that one audit firm to hold discussions. So it may turn out that the client narrows it down to one proposal and the new proposing audit firm discusses with the predecessor auditor and decides not to accept the engagement. So the potential client is back to square one, or rather they have to choose their second best choice. But hopefully there are no bad things about the client that would make it to where the proposing firm decides not to accept the audit. But that gives some relief to the predecessor auditor because he only has to discuss the audit he did with one proposing audit firm instead of maybe having to have the same discussion with 20 different firms. What's also difficult about this is that an auditor is precluded from disclosing confidential information to anyone else unless management specifically consents to that authorization. So typically the new proposing audit firm will provide a letter to management, letter template that management will sign and send to the predecessor auditor, but included in that letter will be discussions about, or rather that they give the predecessor auditor authorization to hold these discussions with the new proposing auditor, and also that the new proposing auditor has to hold those discussions in confidence and confidentiality. And the new proposing auditor has to keep his discussion confidential whether he accepts the audit engagement or not. And so you ask yourself, why would the predecessor auditor agree to hold these discussions at all? Does he really have an obligation to discuss the audit engagement with the new proposing audit firm? Perhaps he's a little disgruntled that the client is bringing in a new audit firm instead of theirs. But to get around that, the AICPA's Code of Professional Conduct requires that auditors have the responsibility to cooperate with each other. And as such, the predecessor auditor is expected to respond to the auditor's inquiries promptly and fully on the basis of known facts. And there may be rare circumstances where he can't respond, for instance, if he's in litigation with the client or indisposed, but in that case, he should respond to the inquiries and say that the response is limited for certain reasons. And so typically the request to the predecessor auditor is accepted by the predecessor auditor without much difficulty, and the discussions are usually professional. So what exactly does the new proposing auditor need to discuss with the predecessor auditor? We've got a couple suggestions here of good talking points in order for the new proposing auditor to understand the client and how good or bad it might be to work with that client. So some of the things that new proposing auditor might ask the predecessor auditor are regarding information that might bear on the integrity of management. So does management typically act with integrity? Also, were there any disagreements with management about accounting policies, auditing procedures, or other similarly significant matters? Were there communications to those charged with governance regarding fraud and non-compliance with laws or regulations? Were there communications to management and those charged with governance regarding significant deficiencies or material weaknesses? And then finally, what is the predecessor auditor's understanding about the reasons for the change of auditors? So all of these things might tell us why the new potential client may be wanting to change auditors to us. For instance, there might have been fraud at the company, or they disagreed with certain things that the predecessor auditor proposed. And so this might tell us how it might be for us working with the new client. And based on those discussions, we can decide whether we want to accept or decline that engagement.